In the meantime, I would like to invite 3 more friends to the panel. First, Dr. Paul McNamara, please. He's Associate Professor at the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Economics at the University of Illinois Extension. Please hold. Thank you. I'd like to invite Tom Anyonge from IFAD. Tom has been a long-time friend to GFRAS. He's been one of the steering committee members from the first hour. Now he's responsible at the IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, for institution and organization analysis and capacity development. So thank you to be on the stage here. And the last member of the panel, I'd like to invite Pamella Thomas from the CaFAN, the Caribbean Farmers Network. The Caribbean Farmers Network was formed and initiated by farmer organizations across the Caribbean in 2002, and their mission is to enhance Caribbean food and nutrition security, foreign exchange revenues, foreign savings, by bringing back agriculture, by repositioning agriculture through the capacity building of farmers and their institutions. I should not forget the important project of MEAS, Modernizing Agriculture Extension Systems, which Paul McNamara is leading. I do have one question for all the new panel members right now. That gives you the time to finalize your questions you have for the keynote speakers, but of course also to react to the answers from the other panel members who just joined. I asked the panel members to give brief answers so that we can look at various of your questions. Well, welcome to the panel. If you need translation, there are the headphones. I would first like to address a question to Pamella Thomas from the CaFAN network. The Caribbean Farmers Network represents over 500,000 of small farmers spread across 15 different Caribbean countries. So small farmers, we heard it also from Krishan, they do have specific demands regarding policies on areas. So my question would be, how does CaFAN support these farmers or farmer organizations in policy-making process? And as a second question, what are, from your perspective, from the perspective of CaFAN, most critical elements when influencing RAS policy?
Good morning. Yes, CaFAN does support farmers and farmers organizations in policy making. How do we do that? We do so by supporting grassroots organizations through formation of organizations in communities where they do not exist. Where the organizations already exist, we support their effort for effective functioning. This is critical for influencing RAS policies in terms of improving the effectiveness of RAS institutions that are responsibly improving for the effectiveness of RAS. In training and development of projects and programs which benefit rural communities. Having group clusters of farmers or producers rice can reach the critical mass versus individual contact. These groups also meet market demands in a better way than individual producers. Personally, from my perspective, what we do, we focus mainly on advocacy. Our groups, we have members in each Caribbean countries, and what we do, once we hear from our members who are all farmers, what are the recommendations they have, where their needs are, we, through networking, lobby the administration or the government or whoever the policymakers are to implement whatever is recommended, whatever is needed for the development of our members. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela. If you have an additional question, we would like to know how the Farmers Network works, what they do, etc. Write the question down. If we have time during the panel, we would like to address it. Now, I'd like, by introducing Paul as leading the MEAS, the Modernizing Extension Advisory Services, I'd like to ask you a question. So, MEAS engages in defining and disseminating good practice strategies and approaches to establish efficient, effective, and financially sustainable rural extension and advisory service systems. So from your perspective, how must evidence best be prepared, packaged, and made available so it has the highest chance of impact?
Thank you. From MEAS's work, and looking over it and thinking about evidence for influencing policy processes, I wanted to make 2 points. And one is that policymakers are not monolithic. There's lots of different types of policymakers that are important, and we're trying to influence them, but to influence them, we need to think about how their differences affect the way we package our messages, what type of messages they're able to receive. For example, think about policy that's made in Washington, D.C. that affects ministries of agriculture all around the world. In the World Bank, in bilateral donors, in international organizations like the Inter-American Development Bank, FAO, all these kind of organizations. Those are policymakers. Their ability to handle information, to assess the quality of information is different than policymakers like Krishan mentioned at the local level. And so we need to formulate different kinds of messages. And so first off is policymakers are not monolithic. We need to appreciate that when we think about evidence. And there's 3 categories that I think we need to keep in mind. First is this international level. These are thought leaders in international agriculture extension, RAS. And many of them are not convinced of the value of investments in RAS. And so we need to step up the quality of the information about what's working. We need to be honest about what's not working and try to understand why it's not working. But communicate it in a level they can understand. And they're looking for high quality evidence. That means peer-reviewed journal articles, high-impact books, conferences, these type of things. They hire consultants who have PhDs and criticize each other's work, and they listen to those people. We need to influence them. So that's the first level. Secondly, national level policymakers. Again, they're not monolithic. We often think of the Minister of Agriculture, but I would contend that actually the Minister of Finance is the policymaker that we need to be thinking about most. How do we get the Minister of Finance to understand that the programs we're talking about are about poverty alleviation and about economic development and growing the economic base? Have we made the case? Have we presented information that can convince people who are not already convinced because they're getting a paycheck through our programs? That's the standard, okay, at the national level. And we are not yet there. There are many skeptics that we need to convince. Also, in many countries, the local level is critical for policymaking. In decentralized governance systems, local governments control budgets. In many countries, we've seen money that did go into agriculture get shifted into other sectors because local assemblymen and local assemblywomen were not convinced of the value of these programs for their own people. We need to put information in front of them that helps. So first thing is policymakers are not monolithic. We need to appreciate that when we think about evidence. Everybody may not be able to understand the research report from an RCT, but many of those people might hire a consultant who's influenced by the research report on the RCT. Okay, second point is we need a variety of forms of evidence to meet the needs of these different policymakers. We need this rigorous type of evidence that David was talking about. That's essential. It's really lacking when I think about other fields I work in health and education. The standards of evidence and quality are different, and we need to strengthen the quality of our information. But we need that kind of summative impact evidence. Second thing, we need very transparent monitoring information within our own agencies, the Ministry of Agriculture. It has to be accessible, it has to be accepted as valid and reliable. That's talking about the program impacts, the amount of services delivered, all these things. That has to be available. The monitoring impact, and it has to be high quality. And if it's not believed, we need third-party verification. And the third thing on information is sometimes the most impactful information is not from a report, but is because somebody is aware of a program, they've been affected by it, and they tell their representative in Congress or in the Senate or in the National Assembly. And those are farmers associations, farmer leaders, especially the ones who are not getting money from a project or receiving direct services. These are extremely valuable pieces of information that convince policymakers. So those are my 2 points. Policymakers are not monolithic, we need to think about them. And second, we need a variety of types of information to meet the needs of these policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. You have also given parts of the answers or questions we haven't heard yet, but I think that's very important so we can make them the link to the different questions. The last person I'd like to address a question to from my side is to Tom Anyonge from IFA, and afterwards we will jump into the questions that came from you. So IFA, the International Fund for Agriculture Development, was created after the World Food Conference in 1974. That's exactly 40 years ago. One of the insights 40 years ago was that the causes of food insecurity and famine were not so much failures in food production, but structural problems. The problems you have been talking about this morning as well, talking about the anarchy of streets, etc. So influencing RAS policies, well, GFRAS and its partners want to address these structural problems. Well, has been defined over 40 years ago. So my question would be, as you have been presenting IFA, what kind of recommendations or experiences can you share with us regarding influencing RAS policies from the perspective of it? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for that good question. I would like to say that I fully concur with the other panelists. They are very valid points, and I agree very much, just like IFAD does. We work with several partners, CTA, from organizations, universities, and more importantly with the CIR, particularly. And some of the evidence we've gotten from some of the things that we have supported, actually the evidence has been generated for us in partnership with IFAD. Just to mention one, for example, we supported the customization of the human food systems approach in East Africa. And I think after 3-4 years, this approach has spread all over. And the way we convinced ministries of agriculture and others to put this approach into some of their strategies to deliver extension services was evidence that was done by people. Then, of course, when Christine Davis, she was here when she was telling us that. To come back to your question about IFAD. IFAD has been in existence for quite some time, about 40 years. And IFAD has evolved. And as my colleague from CTA mentioned, our clientele has also evolved. Now, in as much as we need evidence, one of my experiences I've seen engaging with policymakers at national level and also at the local level is that yes, you can give them figures, but as the Gartner rule goes, you can hear 100 times, but seeing once makes a difference. And I think one of the things IFAD does is we bring people together. We try to bring farm organizations together from across the world to share experiences in terms of you have a problem and there is another entity elsewhere that has actually had the same problem but has a solution. And that way we've seen people's attitudes changing, people's way of thinking changing, and when they go back to their countries, they change. So it is important to have policy and to have the evidence and have policymakers, yes, make that decision, go to Parliament and approve that legislation. But this policy or legislation won't make any difference unless it transforms people's lives on the ground. So the boots on the ground, the extension workers, whether they are from NGOs or the private sector, or even from the public sector, need to implement it. They need resources. They need their structures and the capacities to be built. Now, IFAD over the last many years, we've worked with many governments to try to put in place decentralized procedures or decentralized systems. How do we capture needs of poor people so that services, no matter what services they are, match those needs? And then how do you build capacities of the service providers to be able to provide those with real specialized needs that they require? We've also seen that for extension to be effective, there are other extension facilitating factors. And this, for example, access to microcredit, or even more roles, and our support to these non-extension or non-extension elements, but critical to providing that environment so that RAS can be delivered as proved to be very, very effective. Lastly, let me just mention that right now, most of the countries we are operating in, whether they are mixed or they are emerging or they are still fragile states, we are increasingly seeing demand for new products. And a lot of these new products is not about existing technology. We realize it's about institutional innovation. And 7 countries or governments right now, since IFAD maybe wants 3 governments, are asking for good, innovative or institutional arrangements that facilitate public, private, and people partnerships. So we are looking at ways in which we organize the people, the organizations of the poor, so that they can live with the organizations for the poor, local government, and other service providers, whether in the private or public sector. Now, they're realizing that these innovation systems, these institutional innovations don't exist. And that is why we are funding research through IFPRI, and also through IFAD, and also working with IFPRI to come up with these innovative institutional arrangements that allow people to engage at the local level. I'll just finish by giving you one example. Kalangala Island in Uganda is where IFAD managed to bring together government, women and palm oil company from Malaysia, and the big oil company in Kenya. And we have organized palm oil producers of farms to come up with a tripartite arrangement and form a national company belonging to the 3 entities. And over a period of 10 years, this island has changed. The income per capita, I think 10 years ago, and we have the facility here, they can barely witness, was below 100 per year. It is now 900 per year. Even President Museveni is out to it. Just fly over Kalangala Island and see how it was before, and in 10 years, because of that public-private partnership, we took a lot of energy to put together, is changing people's lives as well.
Thank you very much, Tom, for your explanation and the very illustrative example towards the end. Time allows, I think, about 2 or 3 questions. We have really clusters of questions. The first one is addressing David on his presentation, and the second one is a question for all of you to get more ideas. The first one is built around many cards that were looking at specific words used, the ideal extension and measuring it, and qualitative, quantitative measurements that come from other fields, not mainly from extension, how to use it. But one part, I've been translating the part, brings it a bit down, that I think caused a bit of confusion, that it's worth having a look at it from your perspective. It's a free translation, so I hope I understand the content. You mentioned various times the terminology of transference of technology. So people were asking, well, what's the difference then from the proposal you made to the rule extension proposal from Rogers from 1962? Isn't that an outdated model of extension we're talking about? Measuring input, output, research-based, and then transference of this transference of extension, and then adoption by the farmer. That caused quite a lot of questions. So I would like you to react, maybe to clarify position of it. Yes, please.
Sure. Thanks very much for that question. So Rogers in 1962 all the way through the 80s proposed a lot of different ideas about technology transfer and agricultural innovation and technological change. And there's a lot in his work to unpack and to think about. I do think that we've moved beyond this very linear understanding of technology transfer to something more complex adaptive systems and agricultural innovation systems. That's certainly where our conceptual and our theoretical models have moved towards. Having said that, we do have to measure something. And when it comes to influencing policy, we do have to demonstrate that the return on an investment yields a certain outcome. Now, what that outcome may be, it depends. It could be yield, it could be poverty headcount, it could be soil carbon content, it could be anything you so choose. I'm not advocating a linear sort of input-output the function, production function here. But what I am saying is that you have to measure something when you invest, when policymakers put public resources, scarce public resources, into extension. So measuring some outcomes is definitely important. The other point I think I'm making is that maybe we focus too narrowly on what we measure, that adoption rate, right? That S curve, which is also a very old concept, or those yield increases. What I'm really more interested in measuring, which I think we all should be, are those learning outcomes, the social and psychological dimensions of what farmers do and how they behave, what their preferences are and how their preferences might change as a result of extension. So again, that's a very non-linear perspective. And that's getting into the social psychology of farm households and farmers. And that's something that I think we should definitely be looking more into. And again, Roger's work actually informs us on that side, with respect to perceptions and experimentation and how farmers behave.
Thank you very much. I think that was, at least for me, getting a new perspective and helps to not get into misunderstanding. Many of your colleagues also talk about the importance of evidence, because as we showed at the beginning, often you do not have some robust data that shows the importance of evidence. That brings me to the second question. It's based on different parts again, and that's going to be open for all of you. We are almost running out of time, so maybe quick and short answer. Just on a note, it says, in Africa, decision makers don't drive cars. They sit in the back. So, all the other cars are as well. You know, usually politicians are not led by evidence. They're led by personal observations and preferences. Our policy is really made through evidence and or policy dialogue, or is that just wishful thinking? I think we can take these questions to the group first as well. But I wouldn't like to miss the opportunity to ask our panel members, what's your position on that? We can start with you. Be brief, be quick, then go to the lunch break. I think that's a question you should look at in all the parallel sessions. Not the only question, but also a question, because we're talking about evidence for policy, policy making, policy processes. What if evidence is just one part of the whole game? I don't know if you've answered. You give the answer.
So just very quickly, of course, I absolutely agree. And Africa is not unique in this sense at all. In fact, one of the challenging areas for study is to look at the political economy of agriculture. And that's something that we shy away from, we hide our heads in the sand about. But the political economy, who has power, who influences what decisions, is really, I think, a burgeoning area of research that we can look at and think about.
Yeah, I was trying to understand what the question really was about, but I think I would say we talk about evidence, but it also goes back to the way we are documenting things. You know, we heard about cases where the impact on a policymaker is the story that they hear from the stakeholder. That has more impact than all the evidence could provide. They give that more weight. I think I would say, well, maybe I'm biased on the economic management here to say that it all goes back to the documentation. David talked about lessons learned, but lessons learned by themselves don't mean enough to do. I want to be able to understand the lessons learned, the context in which you learned the lesson, so that when I read your experience, I can then think, okay, is that something that could be applicable in my context? And therefore, do I adopt this approach and test it for myself? So I go back to this term of, we used it yesterday as well. How much actionable knowledge can be shared with others? Again, we are only there to give you advice. You are in the driver's seat. You decide which one is best for you.
Thank you very much, Krishan. Pamella, what's your
Us from the farmer's perspective, that is why we're focusing on a group of farmers giving the policymakers our recommendation, because we are directly involved. The evidence comes from our recommendation, what our needs are. And therefore, in CaFAN, what we do, if there is a specific need or recommendation in one of our member countries, what we do, we seek to find out how widespread it is. And therefore, if in particular, say, in Antigua and Barbuda, we're having an issue, let's say, with land tenure, and we want to make representation to our policymakers about the use of the same problem in Canada, in Jamaica, and so we work collectively. And therefore, when we're getting support from our other members in other countries, our policymakers cannot say that they can't listen or there's no evidence, because we're not only speaking from one country perspective, but we're speaking from several countries.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Paul.
I love the question because it gets right to the power relation processes and policy processes, and we need to acknowledge that. I think one thing that's very important is we have a saying that knowledge is power, and information is power is a close corollary to that. And so that, I think evidence is part of that. And evidence coming at political decision makers from multiple points of view, both from farmers' organizations, but also from donors and missions which come to their countries, that constrains the choice sets of policymakers, and it's important to influence those different levels. And so I would agree that power is important, and you want to influence it in ways that the decision maker can understand, but still don't think of them as having all the power. They're constrained. And in a World Bank investment, the bank is going to inform some of the parameters, and we can inform some of the design work in Washington or in some other place. And that's going to affect what happens, whether it's in Accra or Abuja or some other place. So we need to be open about that.
Thank you very much, Paul. Would you like to add?
Yes. Just to say, I agree with everybody that, policy making is very much a political process. But having evidence is very important. I think it has to be accompanied with other processes. And I have been in that phase with policymakers and driven in the countryside. And frankly speaking, it also goes to the capacity of the people who want to influence change in how they go about doing it. We've seen from our own experience in IFAD is that you have somebody who goes to a country and is there for almost 2 years and nothing changes. And you get somebody else who goes there, and all of a sudden, he's got some attributes of understanding of politics, and within 6 months, he focus again. And I think that goes back to what I think Francisco made yesterday, that we need skills in influencing that policy making process. It's not everybody who can program a policy bill. We have certain skills are needed, patience is needed. I remember sometime back, our country director who told us that it took him following weekend retreats, I think over a period of 2 years to get a policy bill through. That's sometimes what it takes.
Thank you very much, Tom. And thank you very much to all the panel members. Thank you.